Some of you may never have heard about the term transparency report. What is it about? Well, it will be clear after this session that it's actually a very important instrument to safeguard our privacy rights. So we have on the panel, first of all, Artur from Concordia University in Montreal, who has looked into a number of transparency reports, sociological, political research. We have next to him on his right-hand side, but for you on the left, we have Niels Huijbregts, who is a privacy officer at Access for All. That's the second oldest ISP in the Netherlands. It's owned by KPN, but it has a reputation as an, I would say, ethical rebel, if that's correct. They're known for their social engagement. Then next to Niels, we have Mark Lange from Microsoft. He's a director of EU institutional relations, and he has worked with Microsoft since '98. And before that, he started a career as a lawyer in Washington. And next to Mark, we have Nate, who works in the legal team of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which every year publishes an assessment of transparency reports. So he is really an expert on this topic and is willing to share his experience with us. And the moderator of our panel is Eleni Kosta, associate professor at Tilburg University. She's also the one who organized this panel. And I'm very proud to say, actually, that even though she's affiliated to Tilburg nowadays, she actually comes from our stables in Leuven, where she obtained her PhD degree with a dissertation on consent in privacy regulation with a focus on electronic communications. So transparency reports, it's a concept that has become more popular lately, especially after the Snowden revelations, when some internet and telecom companies were being accused of being instrumentalized by governments in massive surveillance programs. As a response to that, they started to publish transparency reports, indicating the number of requests they had received from governments. This is transparency, as we will hear later in this panel, is crucial. And this is a nice quote I found in a recent book edited by Mark Rothenberg. It's a quote from Stephen Aftergood, one of the contributors to the book, who writes about the classic paradox of privacy, and privacy needs actually transparency, which might seem a bit paradoxical, but he notes transparency cannot dictate or imply what the outcome of a particular privacy or national security debate ought to be, but disclosure of the basic facts of government operations is what makes it possible for the debate to take place. So in openness, there's greater protection for privacy. So if we have governments who don't really believe in open government or who interpret it in the way that Jim Hacker, if you're familiar with the Yes Minister series, interpreted, or at least his administration, Sir Humphrey, interpreted, then can companies come to rescue us and be more transparent? That's what's actually on the table today, and I'm happy to pass the floor now to our lovely moderator, Dr. Kosta. The floor is
Thank you, Peggy.
Yours.
So the way how we have scheduled and organized this panel is that each one of the panelists will have a short statement in the beginning, and then we will start with a discussion, and we would like to engage the audience, of course, because we believe this is a topic that is interesting not only for companies and governments, but for all of us as consumers. So first of all, we will start with Artur Alves. The floor is yours, Artur.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. So I've looked into transparency reports. I've been looking into them since 2011, and my interest is communicational. To start with, I was very curious about what it reveals about company policies, about their take on social responsibility, their idea about their responsibilities, and for user information and their privacy. So what are transparency reports? So they are released regularly by companies, usually online service providers in telecoms. Most companies publish 2 transparency reports a year. Some of them publish them yearly. And they are issued in order to provide some level of detail about the requests pertaining to data entrusted to online service providers. The kinds of data that online service providers are asked by governments to give them. These can be user information requests. These can be content takedown requests, including copyright takedown requests, profile data, personal user information, history, files, other content entrusted to online service providers across their services. So, for example, for Google, Google's transparency reports are actually quite clear and quite comprehensive. So we have data pertaining to each of their services: YouTube, Blogger, Search, Gmail, etc. Transparency reports have evolved quite a bit, and they are including more and more information. So the best transparency reports include information not only about data and data requests and data takedown requests and user information, but also about traffic interruptions. So, for example, Google will now now has some information about which countries are blocking which of their sites, which is actually something that was previously in the hands of crowdsourced efforts. Users would report website and other content traffic and other traffic interruptions and blocking. So, for example, a Herdict, a tool that has been developed by Harvard's Berkman Center since 2008, has been reporting on that kind of blockings. We now see, we also see transparency reports reporting on insecure sites. For example, reports on what sites contain phishing elements and other online criminality risks. Another aspect of transparency reports is their connection to transparency policies and social responsibility policies. So they also contain, or may contain, some of the companies include statements about the company's positions on encryption, on backdoor implementations, among other policy issues. So there's a lot of information there, and a lot of it really provides users with a clear image of what the company is doing to preserve, not only to preserve privacy, but what the process and their relation is with government and other authorities' requests for user information and content-related issues. So, in transparency reports, we find a lot of information. Usually, it can be in compiled format. It's like a very general idea of how many court orders they have received, how many requests they have received, how much content they have taken down, or more detailed, really fine-grained information on the nature of those requests. So you'll see numbers of court orders, number of subpoenas, the reason for those requests, for example, defamation, hate speech, copyright violation, electoral law violation, pornography, etc., etc. They are also classified by authority that made the request. In the United States, of course, we have the infamous national security letters, which have been subject to multiple legal decisions as to how to report national security letters and requests that are enveloped in national security laws and in secrecy. And obviously, after the right to be forgotten ruling in Europe, transparency reports now also include information about data that has been altered, or search results that have been altered after a ruling pertaining to right to be forgotten decisions. Some companies include data on compliance. That is, most companies do not agree with all government requests. And so we have information of the percentage or the level of compliance that each company, for each company with each kind of request. So different companies disclose the data in different fashions, right? So historically, Google has been publishing transparency reports since 2009, and those transparency reports have been, in my opinion, by far the most comprehensive, although still far from perfect. As a comparison, another company, Amazon, started publishing transparency reports in 2015, and their transparency report is just a 3-page PDF with very little information, especially in comparison with Google's detailed, downloadable, researchable information, which is much more useful for us researchers to go in and try to tease out the social, political, ethical significance of those numbers. So Google started in 2009, Twitter, Microsoft, and Dropbox followed in 2012. Facebook has been publishing transparency reports since 2013, Reddit since 2014, Amazon since 2015. There are a lot more companies with very different, they're all very different from one another. Telecoms like AT&T, Vodafone also publish transparency reports. So the data, as revealed by Google and Twitter, for example, show that there's a tendency, there's a growth trend in the number of government requests. So there were, for Google, there were around 2,000 removal requests in 2010, about 6,800 content removal requests in 2014, and with more than 46,000 items removed across services. This demonstrates a trend, a really serious upwards trend. Twitter also reports that removal requests are up 26%, comparing 2014 with 2015. So a lot of user accounts, a lot of user information, a lot of content is taken down via these requests. So the trend has been for governments and authorities to actually understand the role that online service providers in providing governments and authorities with data they need in order to prosecute, in order to take down content, in order to find out who the users are, etc., etc. I don't think I have much more time. I have about 2 more minutes.
You can do it.
Thank you. So looking forward, what are we still lacking in transparency reports? So what would we like to see happening in transparency reports? So first of all, given the multiplicity and the differences between transparency reports, I would say that it could be interesting to see much more, a bit more standardization there. So if they were a bit more homogeneous, it could be easier to have a clearer view of the status of privacy pertaining to online service providers. Not all of them are equal. The data format, the data they publish, etc., they are very, very different. So there are some arguments for standardization of transparency reports, especially between consortia like the Global Network Initiative. We are also seeing some agreements about the principles which are framed in data format and in the best practices in transparency reports. A second aspect is we would also like to see, well, probably we could discuss this a bit further, more internal transparency, and not just transparency regarding the relations between the online service providers and governments, but more transparency regarding the internal practices and application of speech rules and speech laws in content reporting inside the company itself. So for example, when users report something like hate speech, what exactly is the process that report will go through before reaching a decision, an internal decision. So we would like to see a bit more on transparency reports about that. A third aspect is the coherence between the end-user license agreements or terms of services and national, international regulations and law, including human rights. So what exactly are the overlaps and what exactly is missing in terms of service and the way companies operate regarding compliance with speech laws, for example. So as a researcher, one of the most useful tools we have regarding transparency reports is having the data available in an easily downloadable and treatable format. So for example, a lot of companies do not provide easily accessible data. And that, I think, is a very useful tool for activists, for researchers, for politicians and deciders to really analyze what is going on and access the finer grain detail of transparency reports. And that's what I would like to see also. Thank you.
Thank you, Artur. So after Artur gave us a very good introduction to what transparency reports are, and he already raised several interesting points that I think will be discussed further during the discussion, we will move on to Mark, who will actually show us what a transparency report is in practice and how they do it in Microsoft.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. Okay, it's up there. Very happy to be here and discuss this, and thank you, Artur, for that introduction. And as you mentioned, Peggy, there was certainly stimulus for this kind of activity as a result of the Snowden revelations. So you can look at transparency reports pre-Snowden and post-Snowden, and certainly an avalanche of them post-Snowden. But even Google started the trend, and well, hats off to Google. Anybody from Google here? It was really they realized early on that level of openness was important, and there was a trickle of us following on from that. But then post-Snowden, there was the additional question, not just that we should disclose data about the government requests, not just the should, but questions about what we could report. And so not long after Snowden, we, along with Google and other companies, got involved in a lawsuit with the US government to enable us to share more data about requests, national security requests we were receiving, because we were previously required by law not to disclose. And our attitude was, well, not only is it the right thing to do for this level of openness, but in order to have an educated discussion, there really needed to be more facts out in the open. Certainly, with all the benefit of the Snowden revelations, there was also a high level of uncertainty as to the extent of the problem. So the transparency about letting us show real numbers could inform the discussion in a much more rational way. So there is a separate discussion besides the reporting, what we're able to report. There is a very active discussion about, well, how do we respond to these government requests? And this is where there's quite a lot of, and showing here's a headline about another lawsuit against the US government where they're demanding data that's stored in Europe, and we're objecting to that. But then there was yet another case in an emergency situation following the Charlie Hebdo attacks last year, where we responded very rapidly. And so there's different measures, different rules as to when the request comes in, whether there's an emergency, but also how we as different companies interpret the rules and the laws, and there's a lot of uncertainty there. And so you'll see different reactions, different compliance levels, if you will, among different companies as a result of the lack of clarity in the law. So that's a separate discussion, but a very important one. But as we look at how we report now, based on interpretation of the law now, I did want to show you Basically, these are going to be some screenshots from our online report. We've compiled quite a number of reports, and you mentioned several types. The ones highlighted here in our, actually called our Transparency Hub, because there's so many things connected to it. The ones highlighted are the law enforcement requests, the national security, U.S. national security orders, and then the content removal requests. But there are, in fact, from this hub, you can reach quite a number of additional reports about transparency of the corporation with regard to political activity, other human rights concerns, conflict minerals and supply chain, all these things that other stakeholders are interested in how the company is acting. So we focus on the others in the data protection community on certain aspects, but there are many other aspects that we feel we need to be transparent about. People have a lot of questions about. And so this is just, as an example, how you can go to all these different reports, but I'm going to zero in a little bit on the ones of immediate interest. So the law enforcement request reports. Can you see this okay, Arthur? Sorry. So when we look into there, it's, we actually have all the numbers and try and display it in easily and visualize the data in a way that's easy to comprehend. And it is very edifying, actually, when you start looking at the numbers. And so for strict law enforcement requests, globally, and this graph covers a 6-month period in the first half of 2015, you see the total number of requests and then how many accounts that affects with the number of requests globally. And then in the pie chart, you can see there in yellow, those are requests for subscriber data and metadata. And then the most slim part of the pie there is a request for content data. So there's, that in itself is interesting to see what law enforcement is looking for. And then also in the chart, just where we didn't find data or where requests were rejected. But from the same page, you can go from global to individual countries, and I'll show you a couple of those. So Germany, you see the numbers here, and interestingly, you don't see anything in Germany or in other countries for content requests, and that is I would say, an area where the reporting can be improved, because what happens is requests for customer content come to us through the MLAT, the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty procedure. So Germany would request to the US government to request to us the content data. Well, the way that shows up in the reporting is a request from the US rather than a request from Germany. So, but we often don't know where the request is coming from. So we'd actually have to get more information from the US government in order to more accurately report this sort of thing. But you see the scale of the numbers over a 6-month period from a country like Germany, and then compare that to the United States. It's maybe a 10 or 20% bump, but it's not a huge number more. But again, if you're interested, you can go through and compare the levels of requests, the number of requests, but also the compliance rate. And in fact, it's not only with people interested in data protection and researchers that we talk about the transparency reports. I've spoken with them about them with law enforcement officials who look at this and say, well, why is my compliant, why are you rejecting so many requests from my country, but you're accepting so many from that country? And they want to be more productive, right? And fair enough, that we actually have to go through and explain, well, here's what a good request looks like, and here's what a bad request looks like, or here's what, here's the kind of information we need in order to comply with a request. So anyway, from this kind of data, there are many different stakeholders who have some interest in learning from it. Then we go to the section about national security orders. And this is the one I mentioned the litigation about. This is where we only got limited ability or permission from the US government to share data. And so what you see here is data presented in wide ranges. So we couldn't say from, at a certain period we got 5 requests. We could only say we got somewhere between 0 and 999. And that's not very, it doesn't shed a lot of information, really, but that's as far as we've gotten from the US government at this point. Now, there is still ongoing effort to push the government to allow us to share more data, for the government itself to share more data. There's no reason some of this has to come from companies. It can come from the government itself. But just to mention here, you can see from the levels we're talking about, it's in the thousands and 10 to thousands of national security orders. And that sounds, by a number by itself, that sounds like a lot, but when you compare it to both the hundreds of millions of customers we have or to the vast levels of investigations that happen, it starts putting things into perspective. After Snowden, I think everybody thought everybody was being watched all the time. And so this is the kind of thing, well, okay, let's get some data out so we can at least examine this a little more closely. And then I'm going to mention here the content removal requests, and you mentioned the different types, whether it's for copyright takedowns or hate speech takedowns. And I just have a part of the chart about right to be forgotten requests that we've received. So that, again, I'm not going to go through the numbers or anything, but you can get, again, when you browse this, you get a good sense of the scale. It's easily searchable, but as you mentioned, Artur, I'm sure there's ways to improve and also to make the comparisons with other companies a bit easier. And finally, I shouldn't fail to mention, because we are in Brussels and you're all wondering about this activity of Microsoft in Brussels, we comply with the transparency register here relating to EU activities. And this is it's not a very old system in Brussels, reporting on lobbying activities here. But it's something we also believe in, that we need to be open about that, and we're quite pleased to get this comment from somebody at Transparency International. Last year said, basically, if you're looking for a good example how to report, you take a look at ours. And that's something that we're very, as you can imagine, we're pleased we've come this far in, not only understanding the trends and the needs, but doing it in a quality way. As you said, Artur, there is quite a range of quality in transparency reporting. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mark. So this was, I think, a very detailed and very clear explanation of how a transparency report looks like for a big company, big internet company like Microsoft. I guess everybody was surprised when you showed that slide where you could only report about orders relating to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And here, just to link it to the next speaker, it's not something that Microsoft or Google or Twitter decide on their own to do, but actually there has been a recommendation issued by the Office of the Deputy Attorney General in January of Washington, D.C., that was published in January 2014, that actually obliges companies to report in this way, and this is one of the big issues.
Back on that, but go on.
No, it's fine. I'm just raising the issue, and this is I was about to say this is one of the points that we will probably be discussing afterwards. So the next speaker will come from European industry. Niels will talk to us about the transparency reports that Access for All is publishing.
Thank you, Eleni.
I work for a relatively small internet access provider, an ISP, internet service provider, and ISPs have a special position since they are in many cases the only party who knows the identity of someone behind an IP address or an email address. There is a delicate balance there because on the one hand we're obligated to provide unobstructed and safe internet access to our customers and protect their privacy. On the other hand, there are cases where we're obligated by law to provide certain information about their identities to law enforcement agencies and such, and allow them to listen in via wiretap. We think this balance, it's very important that we explain to our customers the delicacy of this balance, because our customers trust us with a lot of very personal data, not only their name and address and such, but the content of their emails, the things they do online. This is very sensitive stuff. They trust us with it, and we want to make sure that they understand we handle those data in a good manner. So we wanted to publish our first transparency report in 2004, since in those days it regularly occurred that we got telephone calls from several agencies, police officers for example, just calling our help desk and asking the identity of somebody with IP address X. Of course, we instructed our help desk employees not to give out such information, but they were strange requests, and we thought that it's important to make this information, or to tell the world about this. We wanted to publish in 2004, and we got an email or a telephone call strongly advising us not to do so, because our company director would be prosecuted, and because it would infringe on state secrets. He thought it wasn't worth being thrown in jail over, so we dropped the idea. And then in 2012, Bits of Freedom, the Dutch digital rights movement, asked companies to publish a transparency report. We reconsidered the situation and came to the conclusion that it was actually fine to publish. There was no legal objection to doing this. So we did, and we have been publishing ever since. So why do we do this? As I said, there's this fine balance. We don't want to betray the trust our customers have in us. So I primarily see this as a service to our customers, so they can find out the way we handle these requests and what it is exactly that we do with their data, and how government has access, if they have access to their data. It's very important to mention that government or agencies do not have access to our network. It's absolutely not the case that they're listening in, as it was in some other companies, that was in the Snowden revelations. But well, speaking of the Snowden revelations, they made it very clear that customers or citizens cannot just blindly trust their governments to do the right thing, to act in their best interest. Also, the fact that the data retention was struck down by the European Court shows this. There are things going on that may not be in the best interest of the citizens. So. But another reason is our strong belief that an important part of the right to privacy is being able to know where your data are and what's going on with them, who has access to them, and who's looking at them. And an important part of democracy is citizens must be able to know or find out how their government operates and how agencies are using their powers. In the Netherlands, the government does report numbers on the number of wiretaps, other things we report in our transparency report, but they report on a very high level, not very detailed. So although the government is reporting, and I believe that government should be reporting, I think they should be the main source of this information. I think it's important that companies report as well, so people may be able to compare the two. Now, Access for All, my company is a very small company. We only have about 250,000 subscribers, so the numbers we publish are, they're small. I don't think they make a huge impact, but it's mainly a matter of principle that we're publishing. We are encouraging our colleagues or competitor ISPs to publish as well. Not all of them are, unfortunately. The reactions we get to our transparency reports are mainly positive from our customers and from the media. They're very positive. But it is quite a struggle every year, actually, to publish the report, since there are forces within my company, within our mother company KPN, who would really rather not have us publish the data, not because of any particular reason, but just because they feel it's sensitive. We'd rather not, because it might harm the relationship we have with government. Government is also a customer in many cases. So we'd rather not have you publish this report. Although every year before I publish the report, I send an advance copy to people I work with or I interact with in government, just as a courtesy, so they know it's coming, and nobody ever objects. So I think the objections that I hear are, well, there is really no need for them. Customers do welcome the information in the transparency report, but actually they think it's not detailed enough. They would actually like to know if they themselves are being watched or they themselves are being wiretapped, which is obviously not in the report. So in conclusion, ISPs operate on a very delicate balance between customer interests and legal obligations toward the government. And I think that transparency and the transparency reports are an essential tool to handle that balance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niels. That was a very interesting perspective from smaller ISPs, so it shows that everybody can do something in this big battle that we are in. And last, but by no means least, speaker of today's panel is Nate from EFF. EFF has a very interesting project going on for several years. You will tell us all about it, and I think the catchy title is Who Has Your Back? And we would be very interested in hearing more about your own assessment of the transparency reports.
Thank you, Dr. Kosta, and thanks for having me, and thanks for organizing this panel. I, as Dr. Kosta said, work at the Electronic Frontier Foundation in San Francisco, California. We're a US-based nonprofit. This is our 26th year in existence, and we protect free expression, privacy, and innovation online. We're a team of lawyers, activists, technologists, and international policy analysts. In my practice, I do mainly impact litigation in support of privacy, free expression, and opposing surveillance. I work on crypto policy, surveillance policy, and recently I've been doing a lot of work on export controls as they negatively affect the rights situation around the world. But of course, I'm here today to talk about transparency reports. One of the projects that I manage at EFF is, as Dr. Kosta said, the Who Has Your Back report. You know, we used to keep our personal data, our most private thoughts and feelings, in filing cabinets and bookshelves in our homes, in our diaries, in our papers, in our photo albums. And now it's all in the cloud. It's all in the hands of third parties. And we are forced to trust those companies, those third parties who hold our data. We have no choice but to trust them. And the Who Has Your Back project at EFF is an attempt to evaluate whether those companies are worthy of our trust, at least vis-a-vis the government. Who Has Your Back does not try and evaluate privacy practices, privacy policies, data protection. It only attempts to evaluate companies' practices and how they safeguard your data from government actors. The report is a chart. It has gold stars, which we've taken from your kindergarten classroom. We try and make it we reward companies who do good practices, and we try not to say anything and just let the silence speak for itself for the rest of the companies. We look at whether companies require a warrant for content. We look at whether companies provide notice to users before turning over their data to the government, at least when they're permitted to by law. And we look at companies' commitment to fighting for privacy rights. And one of the key things that we look at is whether a company produces a transparency report. Who Has Your Back has been released every year since 2011. In our first report, only one company, Google, released a transparency report. Every other company that we rated did not. The companies on the Who Has Your Back report are the big US ISPs, as well as social media and other content companies. We don't rank global ISPs because we don't really feel qualified to do so, but the content companies and social media companies that we rate are global, and we do evaluate their global practices as well. If you look at 2011 versus 2015, the most recent report, the difference is shocking. In 2011, only Google produced a transparency report, and in 2015, nearly every company that we looked at, and I think we looked at 26 companies in 2015, released a transparency report. And they run the gamut from, as Artur pointed out, Amazon's 3-page transparency report, which they whipped up literally the night before the Who Has Your Back deadline, all the way to Google's transparency report, which has lots of data. It has videos to help regular people understand it, and is frankly an amazing tool for both advocates and regular users. We see the value of transparency reporting as twofold. We see transparency reporting as promoting accountability in companies and in the governments whose data requests companies are responding to. And I'll give you an example of how transparency reporting has been actually key in our advocacy in the courts in the United States. In 2014, an investigative reporter on our staff noticed that there was a huge spike in wiretap requests coming from a small county in Southern California. So this was our investigative reporter, Dave Moss. The county is Riverside County, which is a rural, sort of backwards hick county in Southern California, near where I grew up. And when Dave looked at the data, not just from the Administrative Office of the Courts, which produces its own transparency report, but corroborated it with Facebook's transparency report, he saw that a single judge in Riverside County was responsible for more than 40% of the wiretap orders in the entire nation. And that's absurd. And we were able to do an investigation that eventually led to the resignation of a prosecutor and the reassignment of a judge, because they were plainly violating both the law and defendants' rights. In the United States, wiretap orders are actually very difficult to get. They're by far the most difficult kind of data request. And the transparency surrounding them is better than the rest. But it was a statutorily mandated transparency report from the Administrative Office of the Courts, as well as Facebook's transparency report that we were able to verify the data from, that allowed us to essentially remove that out-of-control government actor. There are flaws in transparency reporting, and there are some big ones. And a couple of them actually are highlighted, maybe not in the most apparent way, in the chart that Mark showed you guys earlier, especially regarding national security reporting. As Mark noted, up until recently, up until 2014, transparency reports included no data on national security requests, both national security letters and national security orders. If you're interested, maybe after the panel I can go into what the differences are there. In 2014, the government sort of backed down and voluntarily said that, okay, we'll allow companies to report in the ranges that Mark described. The letter that Dr. Kosta referenced is actually not legally binding. There has been no court, no judge to ever rule on whether companies are allowed to report on transparency orders. All we have is the Obama administration's assertion that they cannot. But one interesting facet of the letter that the big companies are abiding by and that Dr. Kosta mentioned, and that is not apparent from Microsoft's transparency report, is that while companies are allowed to report on the number of national security letters and national security orders that they receive and the number of accounts affected by some of them, companies are not allowed to report on the number of accounts affected by the bulk orders that we know, thanks to Snowden, exist. So for instance, AT&T in its transparency report notes that they've gotten between 0 and 999 national security orders and that some X number of accounts are affected. But what they're not allowed to report is on the bulk orders, because we know from Snowden, for instance, that AT&T received one Section 215 order that affected 100% of the accounts. Every single account on AT&T is affected by that order. So when Mark says, you know, it's clear that the government isn't listening to everybody, that may be true for content, although we're not actually sure, but we know it is absolutely not true for metadata. So the national security order reporting status quo is that the government is asserting that while they can talk about NSLs, they can't talk about bulk orders. One of the things that I'll mention as well at this point is the lawsuit that Mark brought up. So this was Google, Facebook, Apple, LinkedIn, Dropbox, and Microsoft, maybe one other, suing the Attorney General of the United States for the right to publish more information about national security orders. And that's what led to the letter that we've been discussing. The letter, however, was a settlement. The companies caved. The companies, frankly, we at EFF view the letter and the company's agreement to the letter as a betrayal of the values that go into transparency reporting. Twitter was not part of that settlement and has pursued instead of suing in the secret FISA court in Washington, D.C., like Microsoft, Google, and Facebook did, Twitter sued in California. And that case is still ongoing. And EFF is supporting that lawsuit as amicus, as friend of the court. There's another flaw in a number of transparency reports, but not all. Facebook's is the biggest problem here. Facebook does not report on government content removal requests, although they say that they do. So Facebook has, in their transparency report, for every country other than the United States, they have a listing for government content removal requests. US, it says 0. We know that's not true. We have evidence that we've gathered through FOIA that it's not true. But the reason that Facebook reports 0 is that the US government doesn't use court orders to demand content removal. They use informal processes, and Facebook doesn't report on informal processes. Other companies do. Google, for instance, reports on terms of service removal requests by the United States government and reports those as government content removal requests. And I applaud Google for that. Facebook, however, doesn't. So where do I see the future of transparency reporting? I see the future of transparency reporting as including terms of service removal requests. Without terms of service removal requests, we can't have transparency reports that provide any actual transparency into what governments are doing to censor both their citizens and other countries' citizens' speech. I also see, hopefully, Twitter winning its First Amendment lawsuit against the Attorney General. The biggest thing here is that, I don't know if you noticed, on Mark's chart, all of the ranges start at 0. So a company is only allowed to say, I received between 0 and 999. They're not allowed to say, I actually received 0. If the ranges started at 1, I would have a whole lot less of a problem with those ranges, but they don't, they start at 0. So I see, if we're taking 2 trends away, my wish list would include that government, the US government, allow companies to report the actual numbers of user data requests and the actual numbers of accounts affected. And my wish for companies is that they report terms of service takedown requests by governments. Don't mistake my meaning here at all. I think that companies and governments absolutely do need to cooperate for law enforcement purposes, but they need to do so with transparency and accountability. And in that respect, transparency reporting is an effective tool, or can be an effective tool, as the Riverside prosecutor and Riverside judge show. Transparency reporting can be an effective tool in enhancing accountability. And EFF is dedicated to ensuring, as this goes forward, that more industries that have not previously been interested in any transparency whatsoever get into the game, so to speak. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I think it was very clear after having heard some information about transparency reports to see how EFF has evaluated, and I think Nate raised some very interesting points that should be discussed. In view of time, I would like to immediately open the floor for questions from the audience, and of course I'm sure that the panelists already have several remarks or reflections they would like to make based on each other's positions. So there is already a question there. Yeah, microphone. If you could introduce yourself very briefly.
Yes, I'm Patrick Pennings from the Council of Europe. 2 remarks. I think first, of course, it's extremely important that private corporations make these transparency reports. On the other side, as for us as an intergovernmental organization, it is equally important that governments report on what they request. And in that, maybe 2 announcements. One is that within the context of our cybercrime convention, we have organized a hearing with private corporations about the number of requests under mutual legal assistance and requests for data within that context on the one side, and that is already giving very interesting results. The second is that we have organized a comparative study between the 47 member states of the Council of Europe on filtering, blocking, and takedown of internet content, which will be released next week. So in that sense, this may be interesting to see to which extent the transparency reports that come from the companies can be linked up with the reports that are drawn up based on information that can be legal information, legislation, practice, requests for takedown. So this, I think that's important. It's 2 parts of the same coin, I believe, and I think that's where we have to go towards in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is another question on the first row.
Hi, Tim Edgar, Brown University. So my question has to do with the 0 and also with the interaction between government transparency reports and company transparency reports. And I'd be interested in the panelists' reaction to this particular problem the government might have. And that is that imagine that there's a certain number of providers of a particular communications service and that the government doesn't have unlimited resources. So it hasn't actually gotten a court order or gotten coverage of all of these providers. They've had to prioritize which ones they think are particularly important. for getting intelligence, national security data requests on their targets. And they want to keep which ones, you know, they have a relationship with a secret, or which ones they have an order against a secret. So if the company reports 0 and then other companies are reporting in a range, that's going to reveal that particular secret. And I guess it's just a question of, first, if you just say, okay, that's just the way, they're going to have to live with that, you know, I guess that's one way of looking at it. I struggle with this issue myself because I feel like that's a legitimate concern on the part of the government. In other words, that's a detailed bit of information. You know, I'd like to make available my report to give you a sense of how many targets, how I'm using this information. That's all important public information that should be made transparent. But, you know, at that level of detail, like, you know, which providers we're working with versus which providers we've ignored for resource purposes, that seems like something they should be able to keep secret. And yet, at the same time, it seems like the company should have a right to say we haven't received any requests. So how do you resolve that tension?
So I think your question depends on 3 assumptions, none of which are correct. The first is that you're assuming a more advanced adversary than exists. If you look at ISIS's chart of which communication services to use, they start at the baseline assumption that every single US-based service is compromised. So they assume that all of them are susceptible to wiretapping. Second, you're assuming that the government has limited resources. And while of course that is correct, in this particular case, the resources that I have seen brought to bear don't suggest that to be true in the sense that you suggest it to be. And third, you know, the adversary is actually not that advanced, right? You know, if I'm a drug dealer or you know, any sort of criminal, if I'm ISIS, I'm already avoiding all US-based services anyway, so that's not a problem. If I'm organized crime, I'm avoiding all US-based services already, so that's not a problem. And if I'm neither of those things, I'm not looking at company transparency reports. I don't think it's a problem. Your comment, however, sounded like almost exactly paraphrased the government's opposition brief to our national security letter case. So we at EFF represent a telecom and a internet company, neither of whom I can reveal their identity because they have received national security letters and would like to report on that fact. They're also challenging the national security letter statute on constitutional grounds in the first place, but they'd also like to report on it. No one is paying attention, right, to whether these companies are reporting or not, except the US government. They are the only ones who aren't paying attention. So I appreciate that you can look at the question, you can phrase it in a way that suggests a significant national security tension, as you just did, but I would suggest that no such tension actually exists. And if you want to read the government's briefing, you can come away with exactly that impression. But if you want to look at the facts on the ground, they don't bear it out. And that's what the court in the Northern District of California said after reading the classified declarations in support.
Bart Perneel, University of Leuven, a very interesting panel. Thank you very much. So in financial reporting, companies have to report, and there is auditors who check whether what was reported is actually what's in the books. Environmental is about the same. It now seems that governments are going to check software of cars to see whether they don't cheat emission tests. So my question is, should there not be a third party checking the correctness of transparency? Of course, the NGOs are doing a great job, but even they can't answer certain questions. So would that be a possibility to introduce something like this? Thank you.
Who would like to answer?
Shall I?
Yeah, of course.
Sure.
Artur?
Okay, so I agree. I agree. There must be a way of standardizing transparency reports. That being said, I'm not entirely sure it falls into the same category as financial reporting. And we'll certainly have to see a lot more interest on the part of citizens and on the part of all the stakeholders in order to see something like that happening. But another aspect which I would like to bring to bear on this particular subject is the amount of information we are starting to trust, not just to content companies, social media, online service providers, but other kinds of companies like automakers and Internet of Things related companies. A lot of personal information is being gathered on the databases of, for example, Uber, Airbnb, companies who, I know about a tractor company who apparently gathers a lot of georeferencing data and even soil analysis data. So a lot of private information, user information, very sensitive data is being garnered by much more than just social media and online service providers. So we should really think about a way of holding those companies accountable to certain standards of transparency, and certainly transparency reports provide, and certainly the best practices in transparency reports show that a lot can be done with simple tools of data gathering and data demonstration. And that's never, I'll just add this to finish, that's never a neutral gesture. Okay, so that demonstrates that the companies actually have some sensibility as to the data they hold and as to their role and their responsibility to users of their products.
Mark?
I guess I could comment. I don't think you'll find many companies who would volunteer for more auditors, but I mean, you make a good point, Artur. What are the consequences of faulty financial reporting can be very grave. And if the consequences of faulty reporting for transparency reports are severe, well, maybe we do need more measures like that. But I think that's the sort of thing maybe we're feeling out at this stage. It hasn't been many years. We fortunately have people now looking at comparatively at what companies are doing, see what's good, what's bad, and then over time also study whether there's really problems created by poor reporting that would require the kind of third-party audit you mentioned. I'm not sure we're there yet, but like I say, I'm not going to volunteer for more auditors until we see more evidence that the problem it requires that solution.
Well, perhaps the auditors should turn to governments. They are the source of this information.
Yeah.
Just a suggestion.
Well, yes.
Are there any other questions from the audience? Yes, one on the right.
Hi, my name is Alon Bar. I'm with Ranking Digital Rights, and we recently released our Corporate Accountability Index, which basically, compares how technology companies deal with privacy and free expression issues. And so a lot of the focus for us has been indeed on their transparency reporting, what kind of insights do they give to their relations with governments, their internal processes, etc. So we definitely recognize from our research that companies have beefed up their transparency reports significantly in recent years. There are still these gaps, and many of you have alluded to them, and for example, these are indeed for internal processes, but also when it comes to private requests for takedowns or private requests for user data and such things. And I was just curious to ask the two company representatives on the panel if you could give a bit more insight for your own transparency reporting. Do you see that you will be going in the direction of more reporting on your internal processes, such as more reporting on how you deal with user information, how you deal with private requests, how you have processes in place, what you do when a company when a government comes to ask you questions for data, etc. Thank you.
Well, at this stage, we are trying to address the kinds of questions you mentioned in the form of an FAQ on the transparency report. I mean, people ask questions, how are things treated, what kinds of requests do you respond to? But that's a simple format, just trying to respond to common questions. There probably can be much better ways of standardizing that or making it a little easier for folks like you to compare between companies. But it is helpful what you and others are doing to help highlight the questions and maybe suggest how it could be better. Because we're sort of feeling our way on some of those. But in general, yes, there is more reporting now and more transparency about what our policies and practices are, and there will be, I think, even more as there's more questions and more experience. I don't think let me put it this way, I don't think there's resistance to that. It's really just finding the right way to report, to meet the needs without adding, excessive burdens. I mean, it's really as practical as that.
Yeah, I have little to add to that, actually. I agree, sorry.
Thank you. Jo Cavan from the UK Interception Commissioner's Office. So we publish annual statistics on UK intelligence agencies and law enforcement's use of interception and communications data requests. And we've had several discussions with communication service providers in the UK about their transparency reports and whose responsibility it should be to publish the figures. And my question really is around checking the accuracy of the transparency reports, because we've struggled for 3 years to draw comparisons just across law enforcement and intelligence agencies because of the different counting mechanisms that they use. And we're pretty much there now with the conventions that we've agreed for statistics. But it worries me slightly with, and I'll give you an example of 2 telecoms companies who actually would report transparency figures where on incoming and outgoing call data. So one company stores that data together, so they would count each disclosure as one request, whereas the other company stores incoming data separately to outgoing, so they would count that as 2 requests. Now, that doesn't seem too different, but when you see published figures that one company's disclosed 20,000 requests to law enforcement and the others disclosed 40,000 requests to law enforcement, when actually they've disclosed exactly the same data, that's a really stark inaccuracy in the reporting. So my question, I suppose, to Microsoft and to others would be, how would you feel if we as government regulators started to break down our statistics into each CSP? Because at the moment we break the statistics down by law enforcement agencies and the statutory purpose, for example, and the type of data. But this year, for the first time, because of the new statistical information that we've collected, we can break it down by communication service provider. So how would companies feel if, I suppose, government regulators started to break down the figures?
So that would be the flip side of us reporting the same, conceivably the same numbers. Is that, but, so what you're, okay, so you're questioning the account.
All right.
Oh, okay. Well, I guess that would be transparency. That would be useful information for people in different ways. And I guess we would, it would be lovely if we could coordinate on how things are accounted so we don't see embarrassing discrepancies that don't need to be, because I think you said it's the same requests, right? It's just how you show them. So, I mean, I guess it would just, if you were inclined to do that, that would be something, yeah, to talk through with the providers in advance so we know what you're doing, and maybe that would help us revise what we're doing so it's more consistent.
From the EFF perspective, we'd love it. I see no downside whatsoever.
And I think the consumers would feel exactly the same. So I am sure that there are many more questions. I definitely had a list of questions that I did not ask, and I will bother all of you via email afterwards. But I'm very happy to see that there was so much contribution from the audience and that you found the topic interesting. Maybe, Peggy, you have a closing word before we go to the coffee break?
Well, it's difficult to summarize this discussion in just 1 minute, so perhaps I shouldn't attempt to do so. I saw indeed that we also in the short description of the panel, there were a number of questions raised. I think we did answer some of them, like do they contribute to transparency and accountability? Yes, they do. Not now, yes, we can, but yes, they do. Who should publish transparency reports? I also learned from this discussion that actually, ideally, we would have double reporting. So you can check accuracy so that there would be government reporting in parallel to company reporting. Might be perhaps an illusion for the time being, but at least it's something we could strive at. What should be the content of transparency reports? I mean, the way you aggregate or disaggregate statistics, or how you include which figures into what. There's no standardization so far, if I understood correctly, but it's something that everybody agrees would contribute to better transparency reporting. And is there a need to regulate the content? Well, in order perhaps to stimulate standardization, regulation could play a role, but here again, we need to convince governments then that about the importance, and they have to also play the game. So it's a matter of bringing everybody around the table and put the noses in the right direction. And I think that organizations like EFF still have a long way to make sure that everybody has their noses in the same direction. So this is a debate which will undoubtedly continue. And I'm very happy that you organized it. I really enjoyed it. So thanks to all the speakers, Nate, Niels, Mark, sorry, Artur, yeah. Yesterday I confused you too, so apologies for doing that again because I called you Nate. I'm sorry for that. And of course, Eleni, thanks to you and thanks to the audience. We'll let you go to the coffee now.